Hello, how's it going? In today's video, we're going to look at 10 moments in Dragon Ball GT that make absolutely no sense. But first, welcome! If you've been enjoying the videos here on the channel, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. With that said, let's get started. Let's start by talking about the strange aging of the characters. Looking at the timeline of Dragon Ball Z, after Goku defeats Kid Buu, 10 years pass until the 28th World Martial Arts Tournament, which is when Z officially ends. After those events comes Dragon Ball GT, which, even though it isn't canon, still respects the continuity. In other words, it takes place right after the events of Z. In fact, the series begins by showing Goku training with Oob in the hyperbolic time chamber. From the end of Z to GT, 5 years pass. If you think about it, that's not a very long time. However, some characters seem to have aged way more than they should have. Krillin goes from a young adult to practically an old man with a mustache and gray hair. He changed more in 5 years than he did during the 7 years after the Cell Games. The Pan, who is 10 years old, age 779, still looks like a little kid, while Bulla, who is 1 year younger, age 780, already looks like a teenager and is almost as tall as her father. Vegeta had a certain look at the end of Z, and shortly after, he suddenly shows up with that full family dad look. Meanwhile, characters like Tien and Yamcha seem like they haven't aged at all. In other words, the passage of time in Dragon Ball GT simply doesn't make any sense. Another thing that doesn't make sense is the Black Star Dragon Balls. That's because they create several conceptual problems with rules that had already been established back in Dragon Ball Z. In Dragon Ball lore, if the creator of the Dragon Balls dies or permanently fuses with someone, the Dragon Balls turn into stone and become inactive. When Kami and Piccolo fused, Earth's Dragon Balls disappeared and only returned when Dende created a new set. However, the Black Star Dragon Balls somehow start working again even after the fusion of Kami and Piccolo, which completely contradicts the established rules. And there's more. How were such powerful Dragon Balls capable of destroying the Earth never mentioned before? And even worse, they were being kept without any security at all. There's a name for that: plot convenience. Another detail. It's said that these Dragon Balls were created by the nameless Namekian before he split into Kami and King Piccolo. But that character was always portrayed as a warrior-type Namekian who shouldn't have the ability to create Dragon Balls. So the concept becomes even more confusing. Another thing that makes no sense is how Vegeta was treated. The Prince of all Saiyans has always been one of the most developed and beloved characters in the series. Historically, since moving to Earth, he never stopped training. But in Dragon Ball GT, he basically turns into a comfortable middle-aged guy. In other words, he stops training. He loses part of his proud warrior attitude. He even tries to recover some of that during the Shadow Dragon saga, but by then, it was already too late. On top of that, the anime seems determined to humiliate him every time he appears on screen. There's no real character growth for him, and even worse, he gets Super Saiyan 4 almost for free. Basically, it felt like a huge disrespect to a character who had already earned the audience's love and whose personality was changed in a very short period of time. After Goku is turned into a child, he starts having difficulty using instant transmission, supposedly because of his smaller body. But that doesn't make much sense, because instant transmission doesn't depend on physical strength. It's a technique based on concentration, not power level. Sure, Dragon Ball Daima also uses a similar explanation. However, even when he's small, Goku can still use the technique, precisely because he's known for adapting quickly to difficult situations. In reality, it feels like Dragon Ball GT created this limitation just to nerf the character, since instant transmission would solve many of the story's problems. For example, he could gather the Dragon Balls quickly, just like he did during the Android saga. Another thing that didn't make sense and that many fans were expecting was the fact that Pan never turns into a Super Saiyan. She had the conditions for it. She was powerful. At one point, Goku even compares General Rildo to Majin Buu, and Pan still fights against that villain. On top of that, in Dragon Ball Z, we see Goten and Trunks transform very easily. So why couldn't Pan or Bulla do the same? Some fans say that because she's the daughter of a hybrid with a human, the human genes were stronger. But that argument falls apart when we remember that Goku Jr. and Vegeta Jr., who are from much later generations, can transform just fine. Another theory said that Akira Toriyama didn't know how to draw a female Super Saiyan, but that also doesn't make sense since Dragon Ball Super introduced the female Saiyans from Universe 6 who transform normally. The truth is that GT turned Pan into a damsel in distress, so that Goku would always have to save her. If she were too strong, it would get in the way of the plot. Another strange thing is that old Kai seems to know about Super Saiyan 4 but never mentioned it in Dragon Ball Z. Especially when the options to defeat Majin Buu were so limited. And even worse, the way he talks about it makes it sound like there had been another Super Saiyan 4 before Goku, which contradicts the story itself, since this transformation was never mentioned in Saiyan lore. Some people try to justify it by saying that, as an ancient deity, he may have witnessed several eras. The problem is that, in Dragon Ball Super, he didn't even know about the existence of the Super Saiyan God. So suddenly, he becomes an expert on Super Saiyan 4 out of nowhere. Speaking of Super Saiyan 4, another unexplained curiosity is the fact that Goku returns to his adult body in that form. Some theories say that the power of SSJ4 breaks Shenron's magic, or that Goku needed to use his full power, something only possible in an adult body. But to be honest, it feels more like an aesthetic decision. The idea was probably keep Goku as a child to remind people of classic Dragon Ball, but also show an adult version to please fans of Dragon Ball Z. In fact, Dragon Ball Daima handled this better since Goku returns to his normal size before transforming. Even animator Katsuyoshi Nakatsuru once commented that this was a problem in GT. This is one of the most talked about moments among fans. There's a scene where a building is collapsing and Goku has to turn Super Saiyan 4 to hold it up. Alright, a building is heavy. Even in Dragon Ball Z, Goku once struggled to hold a bus. But the real problem in the scene is the glass of the building. Because not only does it hold the weight of the falling building, it also withstands the force Goku applies while trying to stop it. So the question is, what is that glass made of? It's meant to be a heroic scene, but it makes absolutely no sense. Another confusing part is the Super Android 17 saga. The plot is already weak, but the worst part is the questions it raises. Is there a laboratory in hell? What kind of equipment did they use to create the android? How was an android with a human base cloned? None of this is explained. Another important point, one of the traits that made Android 17 interesting was his free will, but in the case of Super 17, he goes back to being mind-controlled, which feels like a regression for the character. And there's more. Dr. Gero spent years developing Cell, his perfect creation, but his new plan is to use Android 17, the same android who killed him. Wouldn't it make more sense to create another, even more powerful Cell? To this day, it has also never been explained how Super 17 became strong enough to rival Super Saiyan 4. But for one thing, Dragon Ball GT does a lot, and that I've always found ridiculous, is showing characters who can fly falling from high places, or hanging on to things to avoid falling, even though they could simply fly. Dragon Ball Z movies also have this type of humor. For example, Krillin hanging from the tournament arena, Goten falling with the tractor in Dragon Ball Super, but in Dragon Ball GT, this is much more exaggerated. There's a scene where Super Saiyan 4 Goku runs along roller coaster tracks to escape Omega Shenron, and then he hangs from the Ferris wheel so he doesn't fall. The question is simple, why didn't he just fly? Back when we first watched it, moments like this went unnoticed, but watching it today, it's impossible to ignore. It's the kind of moment that gives you secondhand embarrassment. Now tell me, which of these moments made the least sense to you, and what other moment would you add to this list? And once again, thank you so much to everyone who stayed until the end. A big hug, take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Later!